By the middle years of the war, George S. Patton existed inside the German command system not merely as an opposing general but as a persistent psychological presence, a name that circulated through situation reports, intelligence summaries, and staff conversations with a weight disproportionate to his formal position. German generals were accustomed to measuring their enemies in terms of formations, tonnage, and doctrinal patterns, yet Patton resisted that kind of reduction. From North Africa onward, he was associated with tempo, an operational velocity that seemed to deny German planners the time on which their method of war depended. In the aftermath of Kasserine in early 1943, when the U.S. II Corps had been badly shaken, German commanders initially believed they had exposed the inherent weakness of American arms. Within weeks, that assumption was disrupted. Patton's rapid reorganization of the Corps, his insistence on aggressive forward posture, and the speed with which American units re-entered the line altered German assessments. Reports from Panzer Army Africa began to distinguish between American formations under Patton and those under other Allied commanders, not in terms of bravery or equipment but in how quickly they moved from decision to execution. This distinction deepened during the Tunisian and Sicilian campaigns, where Patton's operational style became a pattern the Germans learned to recognize and, increasingly, to anticipate with unease. German staff officers were trained to look for seams in an enemy's plan, moments of hesitation, or logistical overextension that could be exploited by counterattack. Patton's advances, however, were marked by a deliberate disregard for such pauses. He drove units forward while supply columns were still in motion, forcing German defenders to respond to pressure that did not align with their own planning cycles. In Sicily, this meant that German and Italian forces often found their withdrawal routes threatened sooner than expected, not because Patton had superior numbers, but because his command rhythm compressed the time available for German reactions. The resulting sense, noted in several German operational diaries, was that Patton's forces did not behave in the predictable, phased manner typical of Allied operations elsewhere. By the time the war moved to Northwest Europe, Patton's name had become embedded in German threat assessments as a variable that could not be ignored. The elaborate Allied deception plan before the Normandy landings exploited this reputation deliberately, placing Patton in notional command of a fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group opposite the Pas-de-Calais. The success of that deception was not based on German gullibility but on their existing belief that Patton was the Allied commander most likely to lead a decisive, high-speed thrust. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and his staff accepted the premise because it aligned with what they thought they knew about Patton's behavior, that where he was present, movement would follow. Even after Allied troops were ashore in Normandy, significant German reserves remained tied to Calais, in part because Patton's reputation made the threat of a secondary landing seem operationally credible. This perception did not fade once Patton entered the European battlefield in person. When Third Army broke out of Normandy in late July 1944 under Operation Cobra and Patton assumed command, German army groups experienced a form of pressure distinct from that imposed by Montgomery's methodical advances in the north. Patton's sweeping maneuvers across Brittany and into central France were not merely advances on a map. They disrupted German command coherence. Army Group B and later Army Group G found themselves forced to react to thrusts that did not pause to consolidate, compelling German divisions to move laterally under air attack and with collapsing logistics. German generals, including Heinz Guderian in his role as Inspector General of Armored Troops, increasingly described Patton as a commander who turned Allied material superiority into operational dislocation by refusing to give the German side time to rebuild a defensive equilibrium. What made Patton particularly unsettling from the German perspective was not his rhetoric or his public persona, which was largely irrelevant to them, but the internal logic of his command decisions. He appeared to operate on the assumption that continuous movement was itself a form of firepower, a way to exhaust an opponent's ability to make coherent choices. German doctrine, rooted in Auftragstaktik, relied on subordinate initiative within a stable framework of intent. Patton's campaigns repeatedly destabilized that framework, forcing German units into a state of reactive improvisation rather than deliberate maneuver. In this sense, Patton was feared less as a tactician than as a disruptor of the German system of war, a commander whose presence signaled that the tempo of operations was about to accelerate beyond what German staffs could comfortably control. What set Patton apart inside the Allied command structure was not simply his aggressiveness, which many generals possessed in varying degrees, but the disciplined way he translated intent into movement. He insisted that every order, whether issued to a corps commander or a regimental staff, be framed around immediate execution rather than abstract planning, a habit that compressed the time between decision and action. In practice, this meant that headquarters under Patton did not linger over ideal solutions. They produced workable ones and forced subordinate formations to adapt while in motion. During the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, this approach was visible in the way Third Army's corps were released from static roles and pushed rapidly into operational depth, often before German commanders had even identified the new axis of advance. Patton's orders were written and delivered with a clarity that left little room for interpretive delay, which in turn created a tempo that was difficult for both enemies and allies to predict. This operational urgency was reinforced by his relentless focus on logistics as a weapon rather than a constraint. While other Allied commanders treated supply as a stabilizing factor that dictated the pace of operations, Patton viewed it as something to be stretched, improvised, and exploited to sustain momentum. His staff was instructed to keep fuel, ammunition, and rations moving forward even when formal depots were not yet established, resulting in the improvised truck columns that became the logistical spine of Third Army's advance across France. This willingness to operate on the edge of logistical certainty gave Patton a freedom of maneuver that more cautious commanders rarely attempted, and it allowed him to exploit fleeting opportunities before German defenses could reconstitute. Equally distinctive was Patton's insistence on constant pressure along the front. He discouraged the kind of deliberate pauses that allowed an opponent to stabilize, preferring instead to accept local disorder in exchange for continued operational drive. This was not recklessness but a calculated belief that a disorganized advance was still preferable to a perfectly organized halt. In his communications with subordinates, Patton repeatedly emphasized the importance of keeping the enemy off balance, even if it meant units advanced on imperfect information. German formations, already strained by air attack and limited reserves, found that this refusal to pause prevented them from assembling coherent countermeasures, forcing them into a series of fragmented, reactive moves. Patton's command style also placed unusual psychological demands on his own officers. He demanded not only obedience but an aggressive form of initiative that mirrored his own instincts. Corps and division commanders were expected to act in alignment with his intent without waiting for detailed instructions, a requirement that filtered out those who could not operate at that pace. This created a command environment in which decisions were decentralized but directionally unified, allowing Third Army to function with a degree of internal coherence that belied its rapid movements. When mistakes occurred, as they inevitably did in such a system, Patton tended to tolerate them if they arose from forward motion rather than hesitation, reinforcing a culture in which momentum was valued above procedural correctness. Another defining trait was his use of intelligence as a dynamic tool rather than a static report. Patton treated reconnaissance and intercepted communications as indicators of opportunity, not merely of threat. When ultra-decrypts or aerial observations suggested weakness in a German sector, he was willing to redirect entire corps with minimal notice, trusting that speed would compensate for the lack of detailed planning. This habit of acting on incomplete but suggestive information contrasted with the more methodical approaches favored by other Allied leaders, who often sought comprehensive confirmation before altering their operational schemes. Patton's willingness to move on probability rather than certainty allowed him to seize openings that would otherwise have closed. Underlying all of this was a personal conception of command that blurred the boundary between leadership and performance. Patton understood that a commander's presence, even if largely symbolic, could influence the behavior of large formations. He made frequent, highly visible visits to forward units, not to direct tactics but to reinforce the expectation of continuous advance. This cultivated an atmosphere in which officers and enlisted men alike assumed that stalling was unacceptable, an assumption that translated into tangible operational effects. In combination, these traits produced a form of command that was neither purely doctrinal nor purely instinctive, but a deliberate synthesis of speed, pressure, and psychological leverage that distinguished Patton from every other senior Allied commander in the European theater. For the German command system, Patton's reputation did not rest on rumor alone but was steadily reinforced by the flow of intelligence and the lived experience of their own formations as they encountered his armies in the field. From late 1943 onward, German intelligence services, particularly Fremd Heer West, compiled profiles of senior Allied commanders based on intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and patterns of operational behavior. In these assessments, Patton emerged as a commander associated with unusually high tempo and a willingness to exploit disorder. Reports drawn from Sicily and Italy noted that when American forces under his influence entered a sector, German units could expect rapid probes followed by immediate exploitation of any detected weakness, a sequence that contrasted with the more deliberate pressure applied elsewhere along the Allied front. These analytical impressions were confirmed in Northwest Europe after Patton assumed control of Third Army in August 1944. German frontline reports from the Normandy breakout period described a sudden expansion of American maneuver that did not conform to earlier expectations of a gradual, linear advance. Units of the German 7th Army, already weakened by air attack and fuel shortages, found themselves facing American thrusts that appeared simultaneously on multiple axes, forcing hasty withdrawals and the abandonment of prepared positions. Field commanders reported that these movements bore the signature of Patton's command style, even before higher headquarters confirmed his presence, because of the way American columns pressed forward with little regard for the traditional pauses that German doctrine relied upon for regrouping. Signals intelligence further sharpened this picture. German intercepts of Allied radio traffic revealed a command environment in which orders were brief, direct, and often issued with little advance notice, indicating a reliance on rapid execution rather than extended coordination. To German analysts accustomed to reading between the lines of intercepted communications, this suggested a headquarters that was comfortable operating amid uncertainty, a trait they increasingly associated with Patton. When these intercepts were correlated with battlefield outcomes, such as the swift encirclement attempts around German forces retreating from Normandy toward the Seine, they reinforced the impression that Patton's armies were driven by a central will that prioritized speed over positional security. Prisoner interrogations added a more granular layer to this understanding. German soldiers captured by Third Army units frequently described American attacks that began without prolonged artillery preparation and were followed by immediate armored exploitation. These accounts were passed up the chain of command, where they were compared with similar reports from Sicily and France, building a cumulative portrait of Patton as a commander who preferred to unbalance his opponent before a stable defense could be organized. For German officers trained to expect a certain rhythm in Allied operations, this irregularity was deeply unsettling because it undermined their ability to forecast when and where pressure would be applied. Operational encounters in Lorraine and along the Moselle in the autumn of 1944 provided further evidence. German divisions facing Patton's advances noted that even when American attacks were checked, renewed efforts followed quickly, often on slightly shifted axes that forced defenders to stretch already thin reserves. This pattern suggested a command that was actively probing for weakness rather than committing to a single, potentially costly frontal effort. German corps and army staffs, analyzing these engagements, concluded that Patton's headquarters was adept at converting tactical friction into operational opportunity, a capability that magnified the threat posed by American numerical and material superiority. The cumulative effect of these intelligence streams and battlefield experiences was to transform Patton from a known quantity into a persistent strategic concern. By late 1944, German planning documents routinely included specific references to his forces when assessing Allied intentions, not because he commanded more troops than other Allied generals, but because his past behavior had demonstrated a capacity to turn limited openings into cascading setbacks. In this way, German intelligence and direct combat experience did more than confirm Patton's reputation. They institutionalized it within the German command system, making his presence on the Allied side a factor that had to be accounted for in every serious operational calculation. Within the German command culture, Comparisons between enemy generals were not an academic exercise but a practical necessity, because different Allied commanders produced different kinds of operational problems. By 1944, German staff officers had accumulated enough experience to distinguish between the methods of Bernard Montgomery, Omar Bradley, and George Patton, and these distinctions shaped how German formations attempted to defend against them. Montgomery, in particular, was seen as methodical and deliberate, a commander who built overwhelming material superiority before committing his forces. German generals such as Gunther von Kluge and later Walter Model regarded Montgomery's approach as dangerous but predictable, allowing German units, when they were not overwhelmed, to anticipate the likely axis of advance and organize layered defenses around it. Even when Montgomery's offensives were powerful, they unfolded in a way that fit within German expectations of how a large, well-supplied army would fight. Bradley, by contrast, was perceived as more flexible but still rooted in a cautious, staff-driven command style. German intelligence summaries described First Army's operations as competent and persistent, yet often tied to careful coordination between infantry, armor, and air power. This made Bradley's forces formidable, but also meant that their advances usually displayed a certain coherence that German planners could analyze and, in limited circumstances, exploit. Against Bradley, German commanders felt they were facing a professional opponent operating within an understandable operational grammar, even if the balance of resources was overwhelmingly against them. Patton stood outside this pattern. From the German perspective, his operations did not adhere to the same rhythm as those of other Allied commanders. Where Montgomery assembled power and Bradley coordinated it, Patton appeared to hurl it forward in a continuous stream, creating a level of operational turbulence that German staffs found difficult to model. In after-action reports from the summer and autumn of 1944, German Corps commanders repeatedly noted that Patton's forces were capable of shifting their main effort with minimal notice, often turning what had seemed like a secondary thrust into the primary danger within a matter of hours. This capacity for rapid redirection contrasted sharply with the more deliberate build-up phases associated with Montgomery's offensives. The psychological effect of these differences was significant. German generals could at least take some measure of comfort in the predictability of Montgomery's approach, because it allowed them to plan for a period of resistance even when ultimate defeat was likely. With Patton, that sense of temporal control disappeared. His advances across France, particularly after the breakout from Normandy, demonstrated an ability to exploit fleeting opportunities that Montgomery or Bradley might have considered too risky to pursue without fuller preparation. For German commanders accustomed to stabilizing fronts through calculated withdrawals and counterstrokes, Patton's style threatened to collapse those stabilizing mechanisms before they could take effect. This divergence was not lost on senior figures in the German High Command. Heinz Guderian, who monitored Allied armored operations closely, viewed Patton as an embodiment of the type of mobile warfare that Germany itself had once practiced with success, but now faced from the opposite side. Unlike Montgomery, whose reliance on overwhelming force reflected Allied material dominance, Patton seemed to be applying a form of operational art that sought to destroy German cohesion rather than merely defeat German units. In this sense, he was more unsettling because he attacked the structure of German command and control, not just its frontline strength. Thus, when German generals weighed the relative threats posed by Allied leaders, Patton occupied a distinct category. Montgomery represented weight, Bradley represented steadiness, but Patton represented volatility. His armies were less predictable, less easily contained, and more likely to turn local setbacks into operational disasters. From the German point of view, this made Patton not necessarily the most powerful of the Allied commanders, but the one whose presence most directly threatened their ability to impose any kind of order on a rapidly disintegrating battlefield. By the latter half of 1944, Patton's presence within the Allied order of battle had become a factor that German planners were compelled to incorporate into their operational calculus, not because of any single battle, but because of the cumulative uncertainty he imposed on their decision-making. German headquarters were already operating under severe constraints of fuel, manpower, and air inferiority, and within that fragile system the introduction of an opponent whose behavior was difficult to predict had a disproportionate effect. When intelligence indicated that Patton's Third Army was concentrating in a particular sector, German staffs were forced to consider not only the immediate threat but the possibility that this concentration was a prelude to a rapid shift of effort, a maneuver that could render carefully prepared defenses obsolete before they were ever tested. This dynamic was evident in the way German army groups attempted to manage their reserves. Under more methodical Allied commanders, reserves could be held back with some confidence that they would be committed against a clearly defined main attack. Against Patton, the timing of such commitment became far more hazardous. His tendency to exploit weak points quickly meant that a reserve held too long risked being outflanked before it could be deployed, while a reserve committed too early might be bypassed or drawn into a secondary fight. The result was a persistent tension within German planning staffs, who found themselves oscillating between premature reaction and paralyzing caution, neither of which produced favorable outcomes. The psychological strain of this environment was as significant as its operational consequences. German commanders, from division level up to army group headquarters, were forced to make high-stakes decisions with incomplete information at a pace that exceeded their accustomed planning cycles. Patton's rapid advances across France in August and September 1944, particularly his thrusts toward the Moselle and the Saar, repeatedly forced German leaders to abandon positions that might have been defensible under a slower Allied approach. Each such withdrawal reinforced the sense that the front was not being lost through decisive defeat, but through a series of accelerating dislocations, a process that eroded confidence in the ability of German command structures to regain control. This erosion of confidence extended into strategic thinking. When German planners contemplated counteroffensives or defensive reorganizations, Patton's presence complicated every scenario. Any plan that relied on a stable Allied front risked being undermined by his capacity to generate unexpected pressure at precisely the wrong moment. During the preparations for the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, for example, German leaders were acutely aware that Patton's Third Army, positioned on the southern flank of the intended attack, represented a potential spoiler whose rapid redeployment could threaten the entire operation. The need to account for this possibility imposed additional constraints on German planning, diverting attention and resources that might otherwise have been focused solely on the main effort. In this way, Patton functioned not merely as an opposing commander but as a source of continuous operational friction. His presence increased the cognitive load on German staffs, forcing them to process more contingencies, more potential axes of advance, and more rapid shifts in the situation than their diminishing resources allowed them to handle effectively. Over time, this contributed to a form of strategic fatigue, in which German planners were compelled to react rather than to shape events, always anticipating that Patton's next move might unravel whatever provisional stability they had managed to create. The battlefield, under these conditions, became not just a physical space of conflict but a psychological arena in which uncertainty itself was a weapon. In the years after the war, the fear that Patton inspired within the German command system did not dissolve with the collapse of the Third Reich, but instead became embedded in the way former German officers explained their defeat and their own professional experience. As memoirs, staff studies, and post-war interrogations began to circulate in the late 1940s and 1950s, Patton appeared repeatedly as a point of reference for the kind of Allied opposition that German generals found most destabilizing. Writers such as Heinz Guderian and Friedrich von Mellenthin, who sought to reconstruct the operational narrative of the Western Front for both Allied and German audiences, consistently described Patton as a commander whose presence altered the texture of the war, not through isolated victories but through the persistent strain he imposed on German decision-making. In these accounts, Patton was not depicted as an erratic personality but as a professional adversary who forced German armies to operate under conditions of continuous pressure. This portrayal was reinforced by the way German operational records were later analyzed by Allied historians and military institutions. When the U.S. Army Historical Division employed former German officers to write detailed studies of the European campaigns, Patton's Third Army emerged as a recurrent subject of both respect and unease. These studies, intended to extract lessons for future American doctrine, highlighted how German formations facing Patton were often compelled into hasty redeployments and premature withdrawals, even when their tactical situations were not yet irretrievable. The implication was that Patton's reputation and operational style combined to produce effects that exceeded the purely material balance of forces, a conclusion that found its way into professional military literature on both sides of the Atlantic. Over time, this narrative contributed to a broader historical memory in which Patton occupied a distinct place among Allied commanders. While Montgomery was remembered for set-piece battles and Bradley for steady command, Patton became associated with the intangible element of psychological dominance. German veterans, in interviews and correspondence, often spoke of him in terms that suggested a lingering respect for his ability to disrupt their plans and impose his will on the tempo of operations. Even those who criticized his methods acknowledged that facing Patton created a different kind of battlefield environment, one in which familiar defensive routines were more likely to fail. This legacy also shaped how later generations of historians interpreted the dynamics of the Western Front. The fear attributed to Patton in German sources was not taken at face value but examined as evidence of how leadership style could influence the course of a campaign. Scholars analyzing the collapse of German resistance in France and the subsequent fighting in Germany itself have repeatedly pointed to the way Patton's rapid advances magnified the effects of Allied air power and logistical superiority by denying German forces the time needed to adapt. In this sense, the post-war record treated Patton less as a singular hero than as a case study in how operational tempo and command psychology could be decisive. Thus, the memory of Patton within German and Allied historiography became a kind of shorthand for a particular form of warfare, one in which the battle was waged not only with divisions and supply columns but with uncertainty and pressure. The fear he generated, preserved in diaries, reports, and retrospective analyses, did not merely color individual recollections. It became part of the enduring explanation for why the German army, for all its experience and professionalism, found itself increasingly unable to impose order on a war that was slipping beyond its control.